Welcome to the Deep Dive. You've sent us a really fascinating collection of material, all kind of centering on this one idea, reaction.
Yeah.
And what's immediately striking is just how this single word, pops up everywhere. Physics, biology, psychology, even sociology and philosophy. It's quite something.
It really is. And your sources, they do a great job highlighting that reaction isn't monolithic. It means different things in different contexts. A physicist talking reaction is not the same as a biologist or a psychologist.
Right.
So our mission, if you like, for this deep dive is to, navigate these different definitions, see what connects them, maybe find some underlying principles, really try to build a coherent picture of this universal thing.
It does feel universal, doesn't it? Your reading mentions how reactions, in some form or another, they're just there.
Well,
across genders, ages, cultures, history, rooted right down in, physics and biology.
Exactly. It seems fundamental.
So where better to start than the actual physics? Newton's third law was mentioned in the materials, that action-reaction thing. Can you give us the gist?
Sure. It's elegantly simple, really. Newton's third law, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. It means forces always come in pairs.
Pairs.
Yeah. If object A pushes on object B, then object B instantaneously pushes back on object A with the exact same amount of force, just in the opposite direction.
So you can't have a force just hanging out on its own.
Nope, never. It's always an interaction. You push a wall.
The wall pushes back on me.
Okay.
Makes sense.
Precisely. And that pairing is directly tied to conservation of momentum. Because the forces are equal and opposite within an interaction, the total momentum, the sort of amount of motion in a closed system, stays constant.
Right. Momentum just gets transferred, basically.
You got it. What one thing loses, the other gains.
Okay, but here's the bit that always makes me pause. The forces are equal, right? But the effects, they don't always look equal, do they? Your sources brought up Newton's second law here, EFMA. How does mass fit in?
Ah, yes, that's absolutely crucial. So EFMA tells us acceleration depends on both the force and the object's mass, or inertia.
Right.
So even though the action-reaction forces are identical in strength, if the two interacting objects have vastly different masses, they're going to experience very different accelerations.
The classic bug hitting a car windshield example.
Perfect example. The force the tiny bug exerts on the massive windshield is exactly the same as the force the windshield exerts back on the bug.
But the outcome, not so equal.
Not at all. The bug, with its minuscule mass, undergoes a, catastrophic acceleration. The car, being so much more massive, barely changes its motion. Its acceleration is tiny.
Or like trying to push a huge boulder, it pushes me back just as hard.
Exactly. But its huge inertia means it might barely budge, while you might, depending on your grip and mass, move quite a bit or just feel the strain. So the key idea is equal forces, but potentially very different outcomes because of differing mass or inertia.
That's a really useful starting point, that even in basic physics, the inherent properties of the thing being acted upon its mass shape the reaction.
So let's move to biology. Living things. They aren't just passively pushed around, are they? They actively sense and respond. Your sources get into some really cool biological mechanisms for this.
Yeah, it's a huge leap, isn't it? From simple physical interaction to active biological responsiveness. The nervous system, as your materials lay out, is central. It's like this incredibly fast information highway.
Okay, walk us through the basics of that highway. How does a biological reaction generally happen via the nervous system?
Well, it typically starts with sensory receptors, detecting some kind of stimulus, light, sound, touch, whatever. These receptors then translate that stimulus into an electrical signal.
That signal travels along sensory nerves. The afferent pathways, usually part of the peripheral nervous system, or PNS, travels towards the central nervous system, the CNS, that's the brain and spinal cord.
Right, the processing center.
Exactly. The CNS integrates this incoming information, figures out what it means, and generates a response plan. Then it sends out command signals along motor nerves, the efferent pathways, again, part of the PNS, out to the effectors.
Growth effectors being muscles, glands?
Muscles or glands, yeah. The parts that actually carry out the response, contracting a muscle, releasing a hormone, so it's this loop. Detect, transmit in, process, transmit out, act.
And that peripheral system, the PNS, it has those two major divisions people talk about, right? Somatic and autonomic?
Correct. The somatic nervous system is mostly about stuff we control consciously moving our muscles, and also the sensations we're aware of, like touch or pain from the skin and joints.
Okay, the voluntary stuff.
Largely, yes. Then there's the autonomic nervous system. This handles all the automatic involuntary background processes, heart rate, digestion, breathing, blood pressure, keeping the internal environment stable. Homeostasis.
And the autonomic has its own split, doesn't it? Sympathetic and parasympathetic?
It does. These are two branches that often work in opposition to fine-tune things. The sympathetic nervous system is the fight-or-flight system.
Yeah.
It ramps things up, increases heart rate, directs blood to muscles, releases glucose for energy, gets you ready for action.
Adrenaline rush.
Basically, yes. And the parasympathetic nervous system is the rest and digest system. It does the opposite, slows heart rate, promotes digestion, conserves energy, brings things back down.
So the interplay between these allows for a huge range of responses, from like the immediate danger reactions to just chilling out.
Precisely. It allows the body to react swiftly and appropriately to a massive variety of internal and external stimuli. The whole system is geared towards responsiveness.
Now, your sources also mention these more hardwired responses, reflexes, instincts, fixed action patterns. They seem a bit different from that general sense process respond loop.
They are, in a way. They're all forms of innate responses, genetically programmed, don't need to be learned. Reflexes are the simplest. Think super fast, automatic, involuntary responses to specific triggers.
Like the knee jerk?
The knee jerk is a perfect example. Or pulling your hand away from something hot before you even consciously feel the pain. Or your pupil constricting in bright light.
And how do they work so fast?
Often, the neural pathway, the reflex arc, is really short and direct. It might just go from the sensory neuron to the spinal cord or brainstem, and then straight back out to the motor neuron, bypassing higher brain processing. Speed and automaticity are key for protection.
Okay, so reflexes are like the body's immediate defense shortcuts. What about instincts then? Still innate, but different.
Yeah, instincts are also innate behavioral tendencies, often immediate and maybe feeling involuntary, but they typically involve more complex processing, including awareness. An instinct is usually triggered when the organism recognizes a stimulus as being significant or meaningful.
So there's a recognition step, not just a raw stimulus triggering a muscle twitch.
Right. It's like an autonomous response system that kicks in based on recognized meaning. Think about, say, an innate fear response when an animal recognizes the shape or movement of a predator, or complex courtship rituals, or maternal care behaviors. Even things like an infant sucking or grasping or crying when cold, triggered by awareness of a need or discomfort.
And can experience play a role?
Sometimes experience can refine what triggers the instinct, but the underlying behavioral pattern itself is generally considered innate.
Got it. And then the third category, fixed action patterns or FAPs. What's the deal with those?
FAPs are, well, even more stereotyped and complex than instincts often are. They are innate sequences of behavior that, once triggered by a very specific stimulus called a sign stimulus or key stimulus, run to completion in a highly predictable way.
Runs to completion,
Yeah.
Meaning even if the trigger disappears.
Exactly. The classic example is the gray-lag goose retrieving an egg that's rolled out of the nest. It uses a specific head and neck movement. If you take the egg away mid-retrieval, the goose will often complete the whole neck movement sequence anyway, rolling an imaginary egg back to the nest.
Weird.
Or the male stickleback fish attacking anything with a red underside during mating season. It'll aggressively attack crude models if they just have that red patch. The red is the sign stimulus triggering the aggressive FAP.
So it's like a very specific key unlocking a pre-programmed behavioral tape that just plays out.
That's a pretty good analogy. Other examples might include things like certain courtship dances, maybe burrow digging patterns. Whether humans have true FAPs is debated, but maybe things like yawning or sneezing have some FAP-like qualities.
Fascinating. So we have reflexes, instincts, FAPs, all innate ways of reacting, differing in complexity and the role of awareness or specific triggers. Now, let's shift gears slightly. Still in biology, but a bit slower acting hormones. Your sources talked about the endocrine system, especially for stress reactions.
Right. While the nervous system is about rapid, targeted responses, the endocrine system provides slower, more sustained, and often more widespread reactions via hormones released into the bloodstream, especially relevant for stress.
And there are two main stress axes mentioned, SAM and HPA.
Yes. Think of them as two stages. The SAM axis, sympathetic adrenal medullary, is the immediate alarm system, first gear.
Okay.
You perceive a stressor, your amygdala flags it, the hypothalamus activates the sympathetic nervous system, which then signals the adrenal medulla, the inner part of your adrenal glands.
On top of the kidneys.
Yep, those ones. Signals them to pump out catecholamines, adrenaline or epinephrine, and noradrenaline, norepinephrine.
The adrenaline rush again.
Exactly. That's the SAM axis kicking in. Increased heart rate, breathing rate, blood pressure, glucose release, the whole immediate fight or flight package. Very fast hormonal response.
Got it. Quick jolt. But what if the stress doesn't go away immediately? That's where the HPA axis comes in.
Precisely. The HPA axis, hypothalamic pituitary adrenal, is the second gear for more sustained stress response. If the stress continues, the hypothalamus releases a hormone called CRH. CRH tells the pituitary gland to release another hormone, ACTH. ACTH travels through the bloodstream down to the adrenal glands again, but this time it targets the outer layer, the adrenal cortex.
Different part of the gland.
Right. And the adrenal cortex responds by releasing glucocorticoids. The main one in humans is cortisol.
Cortisol. Heard a lot about that one, the stress hormone.
It gets called that, yeah. Cortisol has many effects that help the body cope with prolonged stress. It helps mobilize energy, increasing blood sugar, metabolizing fats and proteins. Crucially, it also suppresses functions that aren't essential for immediate survival, like digestion, growth, reproduction, and even parts of the immune system.
Okay, so it redirects resources. Is there a way to turn it off?
Normally, yes, there's a negative feedback loop. As cortisol levels rise, they signal back to the hypothalamus and pituitary to release less CRH and ACTH. This usually keeps the system in check.
But under chronic stress?
That feedback loop can become dysregulated. You can end up with persistently high cortisol levels, keeping the body in that stressed state. And that's linked to a lot of negative health outcomes: weight gain, high blood pressure, weakened immune function, mood problems, and so on.
So SAM is the sprint, HPA is the marathon of the stress response.
That's a great way to think about it. Rapid mobilization followed by sustained adaptation. Two key hormonal reaction systems.
Okay, so we have nerves and hormones providing the biological machinery for reaction. But people react differently, don't they, even biologically? Your sources touched on genetics and temperament.
Absolutely. We're not all wired the same way. Temperament refers to those relatively stable, early-appearing individual differences in things like emotional reactivity, activity level, and self-regulation. How easily someone gets upset, how active they are, how shy or outgoing.
And that has a genetic basis.
Research, especially twin and adoption studies, suggests it does. Behavioral genetics points to moderate heritability for many temperament traits. Estimates often range from maybe 20% to 60%.
So genes played a role, but it's not everything.
Definitely not.
Yeah.
Environment, particularly what's called the non-shared environment, the unique experiences each individual has, plays a huge role too. And interestingly, the influence of genes might even increase with age, possibly because people increasingly select environments that match their genetic predispositions.
Gene-environment correlation.
Exactly. And molecular genetics is starting to identify specific genes, like variations in dopamine receptors, DRD4, or enzymes involved in neurotransmitter breakdown, MAOA, COMT, that might be linked to certain temperamental traits. But it's complex, likely involving many genes interacting with environmental factors.
So the key point is our biological reactions aren't uniform. There's inherent individual variability rooted in both our nature and our nurture.
Precisely.
Okay, that provides a solid biological foundation. Now let's move into the psychological layer. This is where interpretation, emotion, and maybe conscious control really come to the forefront, right, as your sources detailed.
Absolutely. Psychology adds this whole dimension of meaning-making. How we react isn't just about the stimulus itself, but about how we perceive and interpret it.
Can you unpack that idea of perception and interpretation? How does it work?
Well, we don't just passively receive sensory information. Our brain actively constructs our reality. First, there's selection. We can't pay attention to everything, so we focus on what's salient, what meets our needs, what we expect. Selective attention.
That's right.
Filtering.
Filtering. Then organization. Our brain naturally groups stimuli based on principles like proximity or similarity. We categorize things.
Putting things in boxes.
Kind of. And finally, interpretation. This is where we assign meaning based on our past experiences, our knowledge, our beliefs, our cultural frameworks. Psychologists call these schemata, mental frameworks.
And because everyone's schemata are different,
their interpretations can be vastly different, even for the exact same event. Your personal history, your mood at the time, your cultural background, it all shapes how you interpret what's happening. This cognitive mediation is a key difference between simple biological reactions and complex psychological ones. We react to our understanding, not the raw data.
That makes so much sense. It leads right into the idea of cognitive appraisal, doesn't it? How our evaluation of an event actually creates the emotion.
Exactly. Cognitive appraisal theories, heavily influenced by Richard Lazarus, argued that emotions don't just happen to us because of an event. They arise from our evaluation, our appraisal of that event's significance for our well-being, our goals, our resources. So it's the meaning we attach.
Yes, the personal meaning is the trigger. Lazarus proposed a two-stage process. First, primary appraisal. Is this relevant to me? Is it good, bad, or neutral for my goals? Does it involve my ego? This determines if an emotional response is even warranted.
Okay. Stage 1. Is it important?
Right. Then, secondary appraisal. What can I do about this? What are my coping options and resources? Who's responsible? Blame or credit? What might happen next?
Stage 2. Can I handle it? And how?
Exactly. And the specific pattern of answers across these appraisals shapes the quality and intensity of the emotion. Appraising something as a loss you can't fix might lead to sadness. Appraising something as a threat you can't handle might lead to anxiety or fear. Appraising something as an offense against you might lead to anger.
So specific appraisal patterns link to specific emotions.
That's the core idea. Lazarus even talked about core relational themes, the central meaning associated with each emotion. And of course, these appraisal processes themselves are influenced by personality traits like neuroticism, making someone more likely to appraise things negatively, and temporary states like your current mood.
Our thoughts literally create our feelings. Powerful stuff. Now, your sources probably also mentioned the different theories about how that emotion actually gets generated, the whole mind-body connection thing.
Yeah, the classic theories of emotion generation. It's about the sequence. Stimulus, physiological response, feeling. The James Lange theory famously proposed, we feel because of our body's reaction. Stimulus, body response. We interpret body's response, emotion. We feel sorry because we cry.
Kind of counterintuitive.
It was. Then Cannon-Bard argued against it, saying the physiological response and the subjective feeling happen simultaneously and independently, triggered by the stimulus activating the thalamus in the brain, which sends signals both to the cortex for feeling and the body for arousal.
Okay, simultaneous pathways.
Then Schachter and Singer came along with their two-factor theory. They agreed physiological arousal happens first, but argued it's undifferentiated. We then interpret that arousal based on the context, slap a cognitive label on it, and that's the emotion. Remember their famous epinephrine injection study?
Vaguely. People interpreted the same drug-induced arousal differently depending on who they were with.
Exactly. If they were with someone acting euphoric, they felt happy. If with someone acting angry, they felt angry. Same arousal, different label, different emotion.
So cognition plays a key role in labeling the feeling.
Right. And then Lazarus, with his cognitive mediational theory that we just discussed, put cognition, the appraisal right at the start, stimulus appraisal. Then both the emotional feeling and the physiological response happen together.
So where do things stand now? Is one theory right?
Modern views tend to integrate aspects of several theories. It seems likely that both physiological feedback and cognitive appraisal contribute. Our bodily sensations inform our feelings, but our thoughts shape how we interpret those sensations and the situation itself. It's probably a dynamic interplay.
Makes sense. A complex phenomenon needs a complex explanation. And these internal states, these emotions, they have to come out somehow, right? The behavioral outputs.
Exactly. The observable part of the reaction. This includes facial expressions. Maybe some basic ones are universal, like Ekman suggested, maybe not entirely. Body language, posture, gestures, vocal tone, pitch, volume, speed. And overt actions: do we approach something, avoid it, freeze, help, attack?
So behavior is how the internal reaction meets the external world.
Yes, it communicates our internal state, allows us to interact with the environment, and is closely tied to both the physiological arousal and the cognitive appraisal that came before.
But we don't always just act on our first impulse, do we? Humans have this layer of control, executive control, response inhibition. Your sources mentioned these.
This is a critical piece, especially for humans. Our prefrontal cortex houses our executive functions, things like working memory, cognitive flexibility, and, crucially, inhibition.
Stopping ourselves.
Exactly. Response inhibition is the ability to deliberately suppress responses that are inappropriate, unwanted, or impulsive. It lets us stop and think before acting, resist temptations, filter out distractions, follow rules.
So it's like hitting the pause button on an automatic reaction.
That's a good way to think about it. It allows for thoughtful consideration rather than just immediate impulse. It underlies self-control, adhering to social norms, making careful decisions. Deficits here are linked to things like ADHD or addiction.
And it allows us to sort of react to our own potential reaction, decide not to react angrily, for example.
Precisely. That's a kind of meta-reaction. We become aware of our impulse, evaluate it, and decide whether or how to proceed. This capacity for conscious modulation, for choosing our response, really distinguishes complex human reactions from more automatic ones. It's fundamental to learning, social adaptation, even ethics.
Okay, that capacity for control is huge. Let's widen the lens again now to the sociocultural context. Our reactions aren't just internal psychological events. They're shaped by the world around us, by norms, by interactions. Your materials definitely covered this.
Oh, absolutely. The sociocultural environment is a massive shaper of reaction. It influences how we experience emotions, how we express them, how they're interpreted by others, and what reactions are considered acceptable or unacceptable.
Let's start with emotional expression. You mentioned universal expressions earlier, but culture plays a role too. Display rules.
Yes. While there might be some biological basis for certain expressions, culture teaches us display rules. These are learned norms about who can show what emotion to whom and when.
So, like, it might be okay to show anger in one situation but not another. We're okay for one person but not another.
Exactly. You might learn to intensify an emotion, like showing more happiness at a gift than you feel, de-intensify it, like downplaying disappointment, neutralize it, showing nothing, or mask it, hiding sadness with a smile. These rules vary hugely across cultures. Think about differences in expressiveness between, say, Mediterranean cultures and East Asian cultures.
Individualistic versus collectivistic cultures often get mentioned here.
Right. Collectivistic cultures often emphasize emotional restraint more to maintain group harmony, while individualistic cultures might encourage more open expression. But there are also rules within families, workplaces. Feeling rules even suggest what we should be feeling internally in certain situations. Culture provides the scripts.
Scripts for how to react, both inside and out. And these scripts tie into broader social norms, right? Conformity and deviance came up in the reading.
Definitely. Our reactions are constantly being judged against social norms, the shared rules and expectations of our group or society. We feel pressure to conform, to align our reactions with what's expected.
Why do we conform?
Well, partly for information we assume the group knows best, informational influence, and partly to be liked and accepted, normative influence. Things like group size, unanimity, and cultural values influence how much pressure we feel.
And if we don't conform, if our reaction is deviant,
then we risk negative social reactions. Deviance isn't inherent in the act itself. It's defined by the social context. What's deviant in one group might be normal in another. Societies use social control, both informal things like gossip, ridicule, or ostracism from friends and family, and formal things like laws and institutional rules to encourage conformity and manage deviance.
So there's this constant feedback loop. We react, society reacts to our reaction, and that shapes our future reactions.
Exactly. It's how social order is maintained, at least in part. Social bonds, attachment, commitment, involvement, belief in the norms, as Hershey's control theory suggests, tend to reduce deviance.
Okay, so norms shape us. But how do our reactions shape our interactions with other people? Social perception, interpersonal dynamics?
Our emotional reactions are huge sources of information for others. When you react emotionally, observers infer things about your internal state, how you're appraising the situation, what you might do next, even about the nature of the situation itself.
So my reaction tells you something about me and about what's going on.
Right. And those inferences then influence the observer's own feelings, thoughts, and behaviors. Think about emotional contagion, catching someone else's mood. Or making decisions based on how someone else seems to feel about an option. Our reactions constantly shape our social landscape, influencing relationships, negotiations, teamwork, everything.
And being good at reading and managing these emotional signals. That's emotional intelligence, right?
Yes, EI is key here. It involves perceiving emotions accurately in yourself and others, understanding them, managing your own, and using that emotional information to guide your thinking and behavior. People high in EI tend to navigate social interactions more effectively, build better relationships, handle conflict more constructively. They understand the impact of their reactions and can modulate them appropriately.
So our reactions are shaped by culture and norms, and they in turn shape our social world. Now, your sources also linked reactions to broader life circumstances like socioeconomic status, SES, stress, and health. How does that connection work?
It's a significant factor in health disparities. Lower SES is often associated with greater exposure to chronic stressors, financial insecurity, unstable housing, discrimination, exposure to violence, less access to resources.
More chronic stress.
Right. And this chronic stress exposure can shape reaction patterns. Some research suggests, for instance, that adolescents from lower SES backgrounds might be more likely to interpret ambiguous social cues as threatening possibly an adaptive vigilance in a tougher environment.
And does this link to the biological stress responses we talked about?
It seems to. Studies have found links between lower SES, high reported stress, threat appraisal patterns, and heightened physiological reactivity, like bigger cardiovascular responses to lab stressors. This repeated activation of the stress response system contributes to that allostatic load we mentioned, the wear and tear on the body.
Which increases risk for chronic diseases.
Exactly. Things like heart disease, diabetes, weakened immune function. Lifestyle factors associated with SES also play a role, of course. But there's evidence that even our day-to-day emotional reactivity, how strongly we react to minor stressors, can predict future health outcomes over the long term. Our social circumstances really get under the skin, influencing our environment, our appraisals, our biological reactivity, and ultimately our health.
It highlights how interconnected everything is. Social structures impact individual reactions right down to the biological level. Finally, on the social scale, what about when reactions become collective? Your reading mentioned collective emotions and social change.
Yes, individual reactions don't always stay individual. They can spread and amplify within groups, leading to collective emotions, shared feelings among group members, often arising from shared experiences or a strong group identity.
Like at a protest or a big celebration.
Exactly. Durkheim called the intense shared emotional energy in such gatherings collective effervescence. It creates a feeling of unity, shared purpose, and perceived group power. These collective emotions, anger at injustice, hope for change, fear of oppression, solidarity, pride, are incredibly powerful drivers of social movements.
So emotions fuel collective action.
Absolutely. Movements often strategically frame issues to evoke specific emotions and potential supporters. The emotional climate within a movement and how leaders manage those emotions can be crucial for its success or failure. History is full of examples where collective emotional reactions to things like oppression or inequality have catalyzed major social and political transformations. Individual reactions, when shared and channeled, can become potent forces for change.
Wow. So reactions operate from the micro level of physics all the way up to shaping societies and history. That's quite a scope. Now let's pivot to some of the deeper, perhaps more abstract questions, the philosophical dimensions. Consciousness, agency, ethics. Your sources likely touched on these.
They did. This moves beyond describing how we react to asking fundamental questions about the nature of that experience, our freedom in reacting, and the moral implications.
Let's start with subjective experience, the feeling of an emotion. Philosophers call it qualia.
Right. Qualia, the raw feels, the subjective quality of an experience, what it's like to feel angry or see red. The philosophy of mind wrestles with how these subjective states arise from physical processes in the brain and body, the so-called hard problem of consciousness.
How does brain activity become a feeling?
Exactly. You have dualists who argue consciousness is somehow non-physical, distinct from the brain, and physicalists who argue mental states are physical states, though they disagree on how exactly. Despite advances in neuroscience, explaining that subjective leap from neurons firing to the feeling itself remains a profound challenge.
And this ties into the free will versus determinism debate, doesn't it? Are our reactions chosen, or are they inevitable outcomes of prior causes?
It's a classic philosophical battleground. Determinism suggests every event, including our reactions, is necessitated by preceding events and the laws of nature. If you knew everything about the universe's state now, you could predict the next reaction perfectly.
No room for choice.
That's what hard determinists argue. Free will, in the sense of being able to choose otherwise in the exact same circumstances, is an illusion. Our reactions are just complex outcomes of physics, biology, psychology.
But others disagree, libertarians.
Metaphysical libertarians argue that we do have genuine free will, incompatible with determinism. They believe we have a real power to choose our reactions, that the future isn't fixed. This usually requires some kind of indeterminacy in the universe or in our minds.
In the middle ground. Compatibilism.
Compatibilists, or soft determinists, argue that free will and determinism can coexist. They might define freedom not as being uncaused, but as acting according to your own desires, values, and reasons, without undue external coercion or constraint. So your reaction might be determined by your internal state, but if that internal state reflects your character and you weren't forced, it can still be considered free. This aligns better perhaps with the psychological idea of self-regulation we discussed.
So how we view free will deeply impacts how we see reactions as mechanistic outputs or expressions of agency.
Absolutely. And it has huge implications for moral responsibility.
Right. Ethics.
Mm-hmm.
How do we judge reactions morally? Your reading mentioned reactive attitudes.
Yes, Peter Strawson's idea. Our moral lives are built around these reactive attitudes: resentment, indignation, blame when we perceive wrongdoing, gratitude, praise when we perceive good actions, guilt, shame, remorse about our own reactions, pride when they align with our values.
And whether these attitudes are appropriate seems linked to free will.
It does. If someone's reaction was completely determined and they couldn't have done otherwise, does it make sense to blame them or feel resentment? Hard determinists might say no. Compatibilists might say yes if the reaction stemmed from their character or values. Libertarians would likely uphold responsibility based on genuine choice.
And moral emotions themselves guide reactions.
Yes, emotions like guilt or shame can signal we've violated a moral standard and motivate repair. Anger or disgust can motivate punishing norm violators. Empathy can motivate helping. Ethical frameworks like consequentialism, judging by outcomes, deontology, judging by rules or duties, or virtue ethics, judging by character, will evaluate the ethics of reactions differently, but they all grapple with the interplay of intention, feeling, action, and consequence.
Okay, one last philosophical link. Identity. How do our patterns of reaction shape who we think we are?
They're fundamental to it. Our self-concept, our beliefs about ourselves and our self-esteem, our evaluation of ourselves, are partly built from observing our own reactions. Bem's self-perception theory suggests we infer our attitudes by watching our behavior. I must have been nervous because I reacted so jumpily.
We learn about ourselves by watching ourselves react.
And by how others react to us. Social feedback is crucial. If people consistently react positively to your helpfulness, that reinforces helpful as part of your self-concept. Social comparison, judging our reactions relative to others, also plays a role.
And theories like self-discrepancy.
Higgins' theory suggests our self-esteem is affected by gaps between our actual self, how we actually react, and our ideal self, how we'd like to react, or ought self, how we think we should react. Over time, these characteristic ways of reacting, the feedback we get, and our interpretations all weave together into our identity narrative, solidifying into what we perceive as our personality traits. It's a continuous feedback loop.
Reaction is truly woven into the fabric of the self. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground within the human sphere. Let's take a final step back and use that comparative lens your sources provided. How do reactions look across different species?
Thinking evolutionarily is key here. The capacity to respond to the environment, irritability, is fundamental to life itself, even in single-celled organisms. Simple movements towards or away from stimuli, kinesis, and taxis.
Basic reactions.
Right. Then, with multicellularity, came nervous systems, allowing for faster, more coordinated, and increasingly complex reactions. From simple nerve nets to centralized ganglia, spinal cords, and brains. All the reaction mechanisms we see, reflexes, instincts, learning, cognition, are ultimately adaptations shaped by natural selection to enhance survival and reproduction in particular environments.
Environments differ wildly.
Yeah.
Which brings us to Umwelt, that idea that each species has its own sensory world.
Exactly. Jacob von Uexküll's concept of the Umwelt, the unique perceptual world of an organism. Each species perceives only a slice of reality, filtered and interpreted through its specific senses, which are adapted to its ecological niche.
So what counts as a stimulus is totally species-dependent.
Totally. A mosquito reacts to the sound frequencies of a female's wings. A pit viper sees infrared heat. A bee navigates using ultraviolet patterns on flowers we can't see. The stickleback reacts aggressively to a simple red shape. A fish might use its lateral line to sense water pressure changes and escape a predator. Each reacts to its reality, its subjective, species-specific world.
So we can't just assume a stimulus-response model works the same way across all species.
Definitely not. It really challenges a simplistic view. Reaction is always relative to the organism's unique perceptual window onto the world.
Okay, so given that diversity, how do human reactions compare overall to those of non-human animals? Your sources likely drew some comparisons.
Well, we share many fundamental mechanisms due to common ancestry, basic reflexes, stress hormone systems, maybe some innate behavioral tendencies. But the differences, driven largely by our expanded cognitive abilities, are significant.
Like the role of interpretation.
Yes. Human reactions are far more heavily mediated by perception, interpretation, appraisal, and reasoning than the often more direct stimulus-response links, or FAPs, seen in many other animals. We have unparalleled behavioral flexibility and reliance on learning, rather than rigid innate programs.
And the executive control we talked about.
Our highly developed executive functions, especially response inhibition, give us a much greater capacity for conscious modulation and suppression of reactions. And of course, language and symbolic thought allow us to react to abstract ideas, complex social rules, future possibilities, things other animals likely don't engage with in the same way.
And culture.
Culture is huge. Human reactions are uniquely shaped by culturally transmitted norms, values, display rules, leading to variations between groups that aren't primarily genetic. So while it's a continuum, human reaction is really characterized by its cognitive complexity, its dependence on learning, the potential for conscious control, and its deep embedding in culture.
This has been an incredibly thorough journey through the world of reaction. As we synthesize all this, what's the big picture? What's the integrated view that emerges?
I think the clearest takeaway is just how multifaceted reaction is. It's rooted in basic physics, unfolds through complex biology, is filtered through individual psychology, shaped by sociocultural forces, and raises deep philosophical questions. These aren't separate boxes. They're all interconnected and dynamically influencing each other.
So social stress impacts biology. Appraisal triggers physiology, genes influence psychology. It's all linked.
Absolutely. And the reason humans react so differently from each other, and even differently ourselves from one moment to the next, is because our reaction is an emergent property of this whole complex system interacting. Our biology, our history, our thoughts, our feelings, our regulatory skills, our social context, our immediate situation, maybe even our conscious choices.
And understanding all these interacting factors, it gives us clues about how to maybe react better, doesn't it? For our own well-being. Your sources mentioned mitigation or improvement.
Yes, that's the hopeful implication. By understanding the mechanisms, we can find leverage points. We can learn and practice emotional regulation skills, things like cognitive reappraisal, reframing a situation, managing our exposure to triggers, problem solving. We can learn to manage our physiological stress reactivity through exercise, mindfulness, social support, or addressing systemic stressors where possible.
Boosting emotional intelligence. Strengthening executive functions.
Exactly. Training self-awareness, empathy, relationship skills, maybe even targeted cognitive exercises for focus and inhibition, alongside general brain health practices like sleep and activity. It's also about building psychological resilience, fostering optimism, purpose, self-efficacy, strong social connections. Our cognitive capacities give us a unique potential to consciously work on modulating our reactions in more adaptive ways.
So reaction isn't just destiny. It's fundamental, yes, driving everything from homeostasis to social change, but it's also something we can potentially understand and influence.
That seems to be the key insight. Reaction is central to adaptation, communication, survival, social order, but also dysfunction and suffering. Understanding it requires integrating knowledge across so many domains. And for humans, it's uniquely characterized by our capacity for self-awareness and self-regulation.
Which gives us a degree of agency. By understanding the forces shaping our responses, we gain a bit more power to choose reactions that are adaptive, constructive, and maybe even ethical. The study of reaction really is central to understanding ourselves as responsive, adaptive agents in the world.
Well said.
Indeed. This really has been quite the deep dive, eye-opening, really. For me, some things that really clicked were seeing that connection right back to Newton's laws, that physical push-pull underlying everything, and the Welt idea, just how different reality must be for other creatures. Plus, the way our biology and environment knit together to form temperament, and crucially, how much our interpretation, our appraisal drives our feelings. It makes you realize how many layers are involved every single time anyone reacts to anything. Perhaps the most, provocative thought to leave with is this. Thinking about all these layers, the physical, the biological, the psychological, the social, the philosophical how, might really grasping that complexity empower us, empower you, the listener. Could it help us understand not just our own reactions, but those of the people around us with a bit more nuance, maybe a bit more empathy? And could it ultimately help us make more conscious, more considered choices about how we respond to the incredibly complex world we navigate every day? Something to think about. Thank you for joining us on The Deep Dive.
This is DigitView.